There is a version of Darcey Silva's story where everything that looks broken makes a kind of terrible sense, and it is not the version most people have been telling. The dominant read you find online lands somewhere between "she is delusional" and "she is being exploited." And honestly, I have entertained both of those myself at various points over the years. But I have been sitting with a different question lately, and I think it is the more interesting one. What if the choices Darcey keeps making are not primarily about love? What if they are about something quieter and more uncomfortable, which is money, platform, and the specific fear of losing an identity she spent years constructing in public? I want to be upfront about what this video is and is not. I do not have insider sources. I have not seen TLC contracts. Nobody from production has spoken to me. What I am working from is the public record. Years of documented behavior on and off camera, what Darcey and Georgi have said publicly, general knowledge about how reality television operates as an industry, and my own read on what it all adds up to. When I am stating things that are documented, I will say so. When I am speculating, I will label it clearly. That line matters to me because the internet has a reliable way of converting one person's speculation into what insiders are saying within about 48 hours, and I am not interested in contributing to that. Here is the thesis, stated plainly. I think Darcey Silva is in a situation that is genuinely difficult to exit, not because she is legally imprisoned by an NDA in some dramatic sense, but because the financial, emotional, and professional parts of her life have become entangled in ways that make every exit from the relationship also an exit from the career, and every exit from the career feels unthinkable. That is not a villain story. That is not a conspiracy. That is just what can happen when you tie your livelihood to your love life on television long enough. Understanding that is more useful than deciding she is either a victim or someone who should know better. Let's start with what is actually documented. Darcey Silva came onto the 90-Day Fiancé franchise through Before the 90 Days, which follows couples who have met online but have not yet been in the same country together. It is the earliest stage of the relationship pipeline, which also means it is the stage most likely to fall apart visibly. Her first relationship on the show was with Jesse Meester, a Dutch model. If you watched that arc, you already know the texture of it. Jesse had a specific quality of correcting Darcey constantly, about her posture, about how she expressed emotion, about her choices in general. There was a now-famous dinner scene that became a kind of shorthand for the whole dynamic. Darcey was visibly distressed for most of their screen time. Viewers were divided on whether this was a relationship with a genuine power imbalance or just two incompatible people making each other miserable, but the general consensus seemed to land on, this is not okay. They did not end up together. What that period established, though, is important for everything that follows. Darcey entered the franchise as someone who wore her emotions completely on the surface. She cried on camera. She expressed longing and vulnerability in ways that most people would be mortified to have broadcast. That quality made her watchable. It also made her an easy target for audience mockery, which she has been absorbing for years in ways that I think have shaped her behavior since. Then came Georgi Rusev, a Bulgarian model she started seeing after Jesse. Their relationship on the show had a different texture. Where Jesse was cold and controlled in conflict, Georgi was more volatile and harder to read. There were public allegations of infidelity that circulated during their relationship. There was visible tension in their interactions. There was also this persistent quality of uncertainty about whether either of them actually wanted to be in the same room as the other. I remember watching early episodes of their arc and genuinely not being able to tell what was happening between them, and not in the way where the ambiguity feels romantic, more in the way where you watch two people interact and think, something is not right here, but I cannot quite name it. The spin-off, Darcey and Stacey, launched in 2020. It gave both sisters a larger platform and, in theory, more control over how their stories were told. The show has run for multiple seasons, and throughout every season, the engine driving Darcey's plotline has been her relationship with Georgi, the reconciliations, the splits, the near breakups, the dramatic reunions. Stacey has had her own storyline running parallel, but Darcey's thread has always been the relationship. Here is something worth establishing about how this type of show functions structurally, because it matters for everything else I am about to say. A relationship-focused reality show requires relationship movement to sustain seasons. If the couple gets together and stays happily together with no visible conflict, there is no show. The genre depends on instability. That is not a moral criticism of the genre, it is just the architecture. The couples who do best narratively, in terms of being renewed and promoted, tend to be the ones whose relationships generate ongoing uncertainty. People who are quietly content do not get spin-offs. This creates a specific incentive structure that does not get talked about enough. If your show gets renewed when your relationship is in visible crisis, and your income depends on the show getting renewed, then your financial well-being is structurally rewarded by your relationship staying in crisis. That is a strange position to occupy, and it is one that most people have no frame of reference for. After enough time in that environment, separating what you genuinely feel from what you are being financially rewarded for feeling becomes genuinely difficult. I do not think that is an excuse for any specific behavior. I think it is a real thing that happens to real people. Darcey and Georgi reportedly married in a small ceremony in Connecticut on November 11th. That date has been discussed publicly and is reasonably well established as part of the record. The ceremony was notably quiet relative to the build-up that a wedding storyline usually receives on this kind of show. Small, quiet weddings are personal choices, and I do not want to overread that detail on its own. But when you combine it with years of Darcey saying publicly that she wanted the real love story, the big moment, the wedding that meant something profound, the gap between what she described wanting and what she appeared to have is noticeable. That gap is the thread I want to pull on. Let me lay out what I actually think is happening, with the clear acknowledgement that this is my read and I could be wrong on specific pieces. The golden handcuffs problem is real in reality television, and I do not think it receives serious enough attention in most fan commentary. By the time Darcey and Stacey had run for several seasons, Darcey's public identity had become largely inseparable from the show. Her social media presence, her merchandise, her public appearances, the coverage she receives in entertainment media, all of it flows from the platform the show provides. That outcome is not unusual for long-running cast members. It is actually the aspirational result for most people who sign up for this kind of television. You build an audience. You have something like a career. The complication is that her career and her relationship are the same thing. The show is built around her romantic life as the primary source of drama and forward motion. If Darcey exits the relationship cleanly and spends season 5 being stable and unbothered, there is a real question about whether there is still a show, or at least the same show with the same audience. I am not stating as fact that TLC would cancel it under those circumstances. I genuinely do not know that. What I am saying is that the fear of that outcome probably feels very real to her, and that fear shapes decisions in ways that are not always visible from outside. My read on the reconciliation pattern specifically, and I want to label this clearly as speculation, is that some of the times Darcey and Georgi reunited after public splits, the decision to get back together probably did not look internally the way it looked on camera. From the outside, it reads like she cannot leave. From the inside, I suspect it sometimes looked like a practical choice about protecting a career that was rationalized into a romantic one. That particular kind of self-deception is extremely human and extremely common. People are very good at finding emotional justifications for decisions they have already made for other reasons. We all do it. The stakes in Darcey's case are just unusually visible. The NDA question is where I want to be most precise, because this is where the theory gets most dramatic and least verifiable. Non-disclosure agreements are standard in reality television. People who appear on these shows sign agreements that restrict what they can say publicly about production, about unaired footage, about contract terms, about other cast members. That is not controversial. It has been reported extensively in pieces about former reality TV participants across multiple shows and networks. The industry runs on these agreements. The specific claim that Darcey is contractually prevented from acknowledging her marriage is in trouble. I do not have evidence for that particular provision. It is a coherent theory, given general NDA practices. But I will not state it as fact, because I do not know it to be true. What I can say is that her on-camera discussions of the relationship often carry a quality of feeling constrained or pre-processed. Whether that constraint is legal or emotional, or just the natural byproduct of knowing that everything you say in this context will be broadcast to millions of people who will dissect it, I cannot determine from outside. Probably a combination of all three. But it is noticeable, and it has been noticed by a lot of viewers over the years, who have pointed to the disconnect between her eyes and what she is saying. The Georgi side of this deserves more serious analysis than it usually gets. Most fan commentary, including analysis I have seen that is otherwise pretty sharp, tends to cast him as either the villain of the piece or an afterthought. He is either the calculating manipulator, or he is basically a plot device. I do not find either convincing. He is a person who came into this with his own goals, his own platform now, his own public identity tied to the show's continued existence. Whatever is actually happening between them privately, he has incentives connected to the show continuing that probably shape his choices too. That does not clear him of criticism for specific documented behavior that reads as dismissive or unkind. It just means the dynamic is bilateral in ways that a simple user versus victim framing misses entirely. There is one more thing I want to address, which is the claim that the arguments on the show are scripted or manufactured. I have seen this circulate a lot, and I want to be honest about what I can and cannot say. Reality television production is known, and this has been reported broadly for years, to involve significant editorial shaping. Producers ask leading questions. They create situations that encourage conflict. The final edited episode does not necessarily represent a neutral recording of events. That is not a controversial claim about the genre. Whether specific fights between Darcey and Georgi were produced in that way, I cannot say. My honest guess, and this is only a guess, is that what we are watching is real emotion running through a structure that production has deliberately shaped to maximize output. That is different from scripted. The emotion is probably genuine. The conditions under which it surfaces may not be entirely organic. That distinction matters because it is the difference between Darcey being an actor playing a role and Darcey being a real person in real distress, being captured by a machine optimized for dramatic footage. Now the counter-argument, because I think it deserves genuine engagement rather than a quick dismissal. The most honest challenge to everything I have been saying is that it might simply be love. Not healthy love. Not love that looks rational from outside, but the specific and sometimes devastating kind of attachment that keeps people in relationships that clearly are not working. That kind of love is real. It does not respond to logic or outside advice. It tends to look, from any external vantage point, like a person making the same mistake in a loop. I have seen it in real life, and it does not feel like a choice to the person inside it. Darcey's pattern with Georgi, the returns and reconciliations, and the apparent willingness to absorb ongoing misery could just be that. No golden handcuffs required. There is also a limitation in my analysis that I should be honest about. I am watching a heavily edited version of their relationship, shot by a production team with its own interests in what gets shown. Editing shapes everything. The misery and the fights that have defined the show's portrait of them might represent a very small fraction of their total time together. Editors can make any relationship look like a disaster or a success, depending on what they choose to put in the cut, and they choose what serves the episode. I do not actually know what this relationship looks like on a quiet Tuesday when there is no camera running and nobody is producing the moment. That is a real limitation. The charitable read on Georgi specifically, and I want to offer this sincerely rather than dismissively, is that he is a person who has been publicly judged almost exclusively in the context of a show designed to capture conflict, and that context flattens everyone. He has his worst moments amplified and his ordinary moments discarded. That does not excuse specific documented behavior, but it might mean that villain is a cleaner label than reality supports. I should also acknowledge that the financial incentive theory I have been building explains a constraint, but does not actually predict specific choices. People make decisions for genuinely complicated reasons, and "she did it for the show" is a cleaner narrative than most real situations allow for. The real version of events probably has more moving parts. So where do I actually land on this? I believe Darcey Silva is someone who made a series of decisions, each of which probably made sense at the moment it was made, that collectively placed her somewhere much harder to navigate than she anticipated. I believe the show is both the thing that gave her a platform she clearly values and the thing that has made clear-eyed personal choices significantly harder. I believe that the genre of reality television is genuinely not set up to let people exit gracefully, and that the economics of it create conditions where staying in a relationship that is not working becomes structurally rational even when it is personally damaging. I do not believe she is in a legal prison. The dramatic framing of that idea is more satisfying as a concept than it is accurate as a description of what is likely happening. Real traps usually do not have clear walls. They tend to look like a series of decisions that each had a justification, and which only look like a trap in retrospect once you are looking at the full pattern from outside. The marriage on 11/11, the quiet ceremony with none of the energy she said she wanted, is the thing I keep returning to because it reads to me as a summary of the whole situation. There is a woman who spent years, on camera and in interviews, describing a specific kind of love she was looking for. The wedding she ends up with does not appear to match that description. That gap between the stated desire and the lived reality is the most interesting thing in this whole story to me, and I do not think it is explained cleanly by either she is blinded by love or she is trapped by a contract. It looks more like someone who arrived somewhere by accumulation, through years of small decisions that each made a kind of sense, and found herself somewhere she did not quite intend to be. What the story of Darcey and Georgi is actually about, when you strip away the dramatic framing, is the particular trap of making your relationship your brand. Once your audience knows you as someone in this relationship, once your income depends on this relationship generating content, once you have spent years building a public identity around the narrative of this relationship, the relationship itself becomes almost secondary to what it has come to represent. You are not just in a relationship anymore. You are in a storyline, and storylines have their own momentum that is very hard to stop once it gets going. I feel genuine sympathy for that position. It is one I think Darcey partly created for herself, partly had created around her by an industry that profits from exactly this kind of entanglement, and probably could not have fully anticipated when she first stepped in front of the cameras. Whether she gets out of it cleanly, whether she ever has the quiet life she describes wanting, whether the show continues or ends or evolves into something else entirely, I have no idea. What I think is probably true is that getting to wherever she actually wants to be requires decisions that will not make obvious career sense at the time she makes them. And that is a much harder thing to ask of someone than it sounds from outside.